Hi, my name is Marcus, and this is a companion podcast for the Jung Helpdesk meetup group. I host live events on Zoom every 2 weeks about the concepts and ideas of the Swiss psychologist Carl Gustav Jung. Every event I give a presentation about the Jungian concept, so have fun with this event's topic.
Recording in progress. Perfect. And I want to welcome you all to this very special evening, afternoon, morning, depending where you are. And the topic today is about consciousness and the idea that Jung had about consciousness. He has a very clear, distinct idea that he explains not thoroughly and every time when he mentions it. So this is something very, very important in Jungian psychology because he references everything against consciousness. So when you get this down, a lot of concepts make way more sense as it deals with how we experience things and how he structures the human psyche, because he gives a pretty comprehensive view how the human psyche is structured and why things happen, such as dreams or visions or just like the experience that are happening to us from the outside or the inside. And getting consciousness right is like an incredibly good step to start understanding Jung. And this I will do. And for a very first time, I will do something that I have never done before. And this is showing diagrams and pictures. So when we look at the psyche, where Jung puts the starting point, this he calls ego. In German, das Ich. The literal translation into English would be I. And ego means perceiving things, experience things. So you listening to me is your ego right now being focused on me and what I'm saying and what is happening and so on. So your experience is kind of limited by what you're able to see and experience and hear and all these different things. And you can do this right now in this situation. But for example, you don't know what's happening in the apartment under you, right? Or on the other side of the world. Or like certain things that are happening inside your body. On the background of your mind, things are turning, but you might not be aware of them. You might not experience them. And if you, for example, go to sleep, there's a part of our psyche that becomes active that we normally do not experience, as our ego is going into this sleeping phase and sleeping world where we encounter our dreams, we experience them. So as soon as we see, recognize, and also remember something, it was in contact with our ego. Our ego experienced it. And around the ego, consciousness is forming. And this is like a necessary function and development by the ego experiencing things. And Jung, I have here the first quote, the ego, the center of consciousness, the ego is a condition sine qua non of consciousness as such. And for all the people who understand Latin, know and recognize immediately that conditio sine qua non means essential function. So without ego, there is no consciousness, because everything that happens to us is connected to the ego. Like when I talk about myself, right, I'm mentioning things that are related to my ego. For example, me introducing the C.G. Jung Helpdesk, I'm talking about a lot of things that I've done and experienced. So this is all connected to my ego. Like I have done this, I had these thoughts, I had these ideas, I am doing these things. So as always, I. And this is because it's connected. And this is why the ego is in the center of consciousness. And consciousness forms around the ego. And of course, as we get older and experience more and more things, this consciousness grows more and more. As we do more things, we learn more things, we understand more things. But what lies outside of consciousness, and that's the unconscious. And there, Jung has a pretty easy definition, and it's in the name. Like everything which is not in consciousness is unconscious. And that can be the outside world, just like things happening in the apartment down below or on the other side of the world or deep inside my psyche. These are unconscious to me. They're unavailable to me. I do not have a connection to them because I have not experienced them yet. or cannot experience them because of a separation. Might be physical, but also mentally. And the unconscious as such is then all around us. Like we're surrounded by the unconscious stuff. We're surrounded by things we do not know, that we do not understand, and we cannot comprehend yet. Because ego consciousness, that's comprehension, that's the known, while everything else is very much complicated. For example, let's say you play the guitar, like then the guitar and playing moving your fingers and having a feeling for sound and all these different things, and having like, oh, this is my guitar and I learned it when I did this, and these are my friends I play the guitar with, and so on. You notice I. This is then all on my consciousness. But for example, when the tuba is then the unconscious, no idea how to play, and this is then pretty far removed. Pretty important, and this is one of the key aspects I want to give to you. Jung never talks about the subconscious. He always talks about the unconscious, so the things that are not in consciousness. And I have a quote here for that. This is why so many people say subconscious instead of unconscious. One is then rather more noble because one is above. So saying that subconscious, something is lower, already is a kind of values of judgment. Oh, these are the not so important things. Those are the lesser things. Seeing it from a Freudian view would be, oh, those are the primal emotions and like primal drives that are rather archaic and primitive. And like, I'm more noble, I'm above that. But Jung says, no, like the unconscious is around us everywhere. Like also our future, how we will develop and what we will develop into is also there. So it's not like the dark, shady stuff we should not touch, and which is like a happy or unhappy accident, as in Freudian psychology. Jung says, oh no, like all the future development, all the things you can learn and do and so on, this is all in the unconscious. So it is below you, yes, but it's also above you. It's in front of you, but it's also behind you. As you can be very oblivious about your future, but you can also be oblivious about your past. So the unconsciousness or the unconscious surrounds us in all directions. And this is what I tried to represent here. So we will dig deeper into how consciousness is structured. And I have a quote for that. Our consciousness in the center is like a spider in its web, with threads through which the psychic contents are associated with the eye. This is what I mentioned before. So imagine having a job interview and you give your life story. Of course, you reference everything to yourself. Or when you meet someone new and you talk then about things you have experienced, you have done, you have thought about, and all these different things. And even when you then talk about other people, you can only talk about people that you've heard and known about. Like there's 8 billion people. The amount of people one actually knows is way, way, way smaller. So everything is then connected to the I and reference to my, mine, and so on. And this is what you can see here. You have these different contents as circles within the big circle of consciousness, and they have relations to each other because you can jump from them. Like, oh yeah, I learned guitar at that place and I know this person and they played guitar for, and so on and so on. So there's a logical connection. And this is then the main distinguishment between things that are consciousness and things that are in the unconscious, because this relation is missing. Like, I do not know what I don't know. So there's no connection there. And we, of course, can learn and expand our consciousness and further things that we know and can do and experience and so on. But there are these things that are just out of reach because there's not a connection there that connects to the things that we already have, that do not connect to this net. This metaphor for the net is very important, and I will reference it later in context of perception. So what you can see here, in the unconscious, you have other contents that do not yet really fit into consciousness. They have different shapes and they become weirder and weirder. And this is how the unconscious is. It is not really easy to integrate. And this is why it's unconscious. These are things you cannot fit in with all the other stuff. For example, like in traumatic experience or negative experience, when people like push it away and do not want to deal with it, it is pushed into the unconscious. It does not get connected. It does not get unpacked and integrated. So it stays in some unwieldy form that is inconvenient and not nice to experience and stays in the unconscious and is outside of the realm of consciousness. All right, some quotes for the ego. It is only our ego consciousness that has forever a new beginning and an early end. The unconscious psyche is not only immensely old, it is also capable of growing into an equally remote future. It mounts the human species and is just as much a part of it as the human body, which, though ephemeral in the individual, it is collectively of immense age. So I've referenced a lot the ego as the I and the things that I do and I've done and all these things. That creates your individual life as you are. And you are new. And everything that exists and you're experiencing is new to you. Like human beings existed for millions of years and living organisms even longer, for billions of years. But for your individual life, what you're experiencing is new. Like growing up, having parents, falling in love the first time, having the first job, and all these first experiences, they are new to you, but of course to the psyche that we have and to our human nature, these are things that have repeated so often that they became kind of codified in our human nature as like a treasure trove of already a priori experience and patterns that we have inside of us. And Jung calls those patterns archetypes, as they have repeated so often that they are part of our psychology and of every newly born human being. And this is why we kind of know how to do a lot of things. Similar as we have animals that have mating rituals that are not trained in those mating rituals, but they know what to do. Similar, we have the same thing. Like we do already a lot of things because our psyche gives us hints how to do it. But of course, like doing it the first time is always scary. And this is because it's completely new to the ego and we are overwhelmed with all these unconscious contents, which are not yet fully integrated in our consciousness. So of course, the more and more we do things and we get used to things, they're more ingrained in our consciousness and we're more at ease, we're more at calm. But of course, to us, it's always then these things are new. And this is what Jung writes here. The ego is the expression of individual existence. So you as an individual, as you are unique in your life's journey and your experiences and the thoughts you're having, all these different things. And this is your consciousness. This is your ego. In the unconscious, it's a little bit more collective in the sense of it is not as refined. Like, for example, when we have emotions and say, for example, anger is something very collective as it is similar for everyone. But what we create out of anger by being it integrated into our consciousness can be something completely different. For example, when you are a salesperson or you're an athlete or your mother, like how you integrate anger and use it sensible in the right situation is an individual expression what you do out of these, let's say, standardized psychological phenomena. So talking about then consciousness, which is around the ego, there's some bullet points here that I will go through. And this really took a long time to assemble. So what Jung says, one of the key functions and the key characteristics of consciousness and the function of consciousness is that of separation, of discrimination. That means the separation of things. Already saying I separates one from everything around us. And when you have a small child which is growing up, like the first favorite word will be no. Because suddenly they have influence. Suddenly they can separate themselves from things that are happening to them. And one of the important things, for example, in therapy is when you have an emotion or a thought, what Jung would teach to his patients is to learn how to separate oneself from this emotion or this thought. Not saying like, oh, this is not real or it's not important or all these different things, but saying like, okay, just because it's inside of you and it's happening right now does not mean you have to act it out immediately, unthinkingly. So Jung sees consciousness as a kind of sorting mechanism to sort things out and to differentiate them. So, for example, when we are in a new situation and we do not know what's going on, it's completely overwhelming. For example, driving a car, right? There's so many things you can do and you have so many things you have to pay attention to. What somebody like an instructor will tell you, oh, watch out for this, now do this. So they will go step by step and saying of this huge mess, which is a car and traffic, to say like, okay, we will learn this little step, then this little step, then this little step, so that you build these patterns to know how to prioritize information. And this is then what consciousness does. It prioritizes and sorts information by how important it is. And for that, of course, you need a goal, you need a direction. And this is also what ego and consciousness does. It gives direction and it allows us to do things willfully and with purpose. We can focus on something. And this is incredibly, incredibly hard. So when you have children and you put them into school, the goal in a sense is there to teach them how to focus on certain stimuli and certain experiences or thoughts so that they can invest more into it and integrate it into their consciousness. So willfully directed thinking and behavior. If you want to learn math, like you really have to concentrate. It's not a lot of fun for most people. And it's just like driving a car. It's a pain in the beginning. You don't know what you're doing. Likely you're wrong and so on. And somebody points out, okay, you have to do this and then you have to do this. And for that, focused attention is necessary. When you're sleeping, when you're drunk, when you are very tired, there's not a lot of focused attention there. So things are just happening to you, but they really don't stay with you. It's a very, very passive activity. But when you do something actively, this is how you learn. And this is a function of consciousness and of ego, this willful action. Through that, not only doing things willfully, but also willfully not doing things. Jung says human beings are very different from the, let's say, animal kingdom. Because we're not blindly following our instincts. We can separate ourselves from our instincts and can then follow, moral acts. We can act morally. We can actively choose to do things that are good and actively not do things that are not good. And this comes back to the idea of evil. Like, is a lion evil? Like, no. A lion can't really be evil because a lion is just a lion. When he's hungry, he will hunt and he will eat. But human beings, we have a choice what we do. Like, we don't have to blindly act our instincts, right? When we're angry, we don't have to kill the other person immediately or hurt them. Like, we can also find another way. We can try to discuss with them and remove misunderstandings or find an agreement, make a negotiation. And this is already a sign of civilized cultural behavior to be in control of oneself, as one would say. And this means like doing things willfully, but also willfully not doing things. And human beings in that regard are pretty unique, as we don't see this kind of behavior a lot somewhere else in the animal kingdom or on Earth, to really have this sophistication and adaptability of behavior. Like when you have animals, they very often have very elaborate instincts that are like crazy, and they're enough for an animal to live its whole life without problem. But human beings have this to go against the grain, right? To go against nature and to act outside of the initial programming that everybody has. And I want to bring a story from the Bible, basically from the creation myth, where you have like God creating all the animals and then creating human beings. And one would think, okay, yeah, human beings, they really let down God. They did their own thing and now they're thrown out of paradise. And animals should be like the perfect beings for God because they're just acting out their instincts. They're doing just as the programming says. But at the same time, it's said, God loves human beings the most because we can decide whether we then follow God or we don't follow. Just as a metaphor to show how special then consciousness is and what we can do with it. So what we can do with consciousness, and which is the biggest advantage of consciousness, is this form of adaptation. There's a reason why human beings can kind of survive everywhere on the planet, because we can change our environment, we can change ourselves and adapt to the current situations. So when you have an animal, they're pretty much limited that the temperature is right, that the weather is right, that the food is right. But human beings, we can go everywhere. We can even go into space. And this is because we can change and adapt our environment depending on our needs. And this is because we can learn and understand our environment, but also we can model our behavior to ensure that we can survive. And this is now very far-fetched. Let's bring it down to something way more closer. So when you have a child which is growing up, it gets socialized by its parents and its surroundings, so it learns how to fit into a group and into a society, and also school, friend group, at work, and so on. So we can change and adapt in our consciousness, we can learn new things, we can do new things, and that allows us really to fill out many, many different ways of living. So animals, when you have a dog, there's not so much individuality there and a variety of lifestyles of a dog, but human beings are amazing. If you look into the modern world, it's crazy how different people can live. You have some people who are astronauts, you have some people who are artists, you have some people who are athletes. So, and they are all focused on different parts of reality and adapted their consciousness to able to interact and process the experience that they're having there. I really like to give a friend of mine as an example who's a geologist. So I'm not a geologist. I don't know a lot about it. But when I go on a walk with him, he can tell me what happened in this place 10,000 years ago, millions of years ago, billions of years ago, and say I can see it in the ground here and how the landscapes are formed and all these different things, because it's part of his consciousness. It was part of his training. And this is how he would adapt and also make then his money in this complicated place, which is the modern economy. By having our consciousness and our ego and relating the things that are happening to us to our consciousness, we create a continuity. And I referenced that before. We create a life story of us. Okay, where were we and where do we want to go? We have these memories available to all the experiences that we have, which is, of course, less than we actually experienced. But to have this continuity of a life story is incredibly important. We're not really living day to day, but rather we have the feeling that we're going into a certain direction and we're coming from a certain place. And where there are different models of therapy is then, for example, writing down these life stories and trying to make sense of these different stages of lives. And this is then a conscious function. You take these things, you separate them, you organize them, you structure them, you try to combine them so that they make sense as a whole. And this is what consciousness is about, is making sense of things. And I have two quotes. Without the reflective consciousness of man, the world is of gigantic meaninglessness. Because in our experience, man is the only being that can determine meaning at all. And anything conscious can be corrected, but anything that slips away into the unconscious is beyond the reach of correction, and its rank growth undisturbed. It's subjective to increasing degeneration. I want to explain the second quote first. Jung says when you have a trauma, or he often calls it a neurosis or complex. So a bad experience you don't want to interact with. If you really put it away into your unconscious and you repress it, it will not change. It will be immortal like that. the experience of touching it will always be the same for decades or for the whole of life. So the negative experience will be just as it happened. Changing that means willfully interacting with that and dissecting it, trying to make sense of it, combining it with other contents, bringing it to light, as we would say. And then it starts to transform, and then it starts to change. So a lot of what psychoanalysis is about, and this talk and cure, is to talk about things, to talk about uncomfortable things, talk about unprocessed things, so things that are in the unconscious, to bring them into consciousness and make them available to the person again, so that they are able to talk about it, for example, without having a strong emotional reaction. And this is something that what consciousness does. And where Jung says, this is this reflective function of consciousness, which is unique to us, but it has to be in consciousness. We actively have to engage with it. When it's in the unconscious, it will be there, immortal, unchanged, like an open wound that never heals. The first quote, Jung sees meaning also in consciousness. So if you would ask Jung this question or riddle of when a tree falls and there's no one there to hear it, does it make a sound? Jung would say, no, it does not. Because what we're doing with our consciousness is creating a world which is not necessarily objective. Just because we experience it like that does not mean it is in an objective, eternal way like this. Like we as human beings, as we are here, for example, can see color, but we can see a lot of other things not. We can't see infrared. We can't see magnetic waves. There are a lot of things we cannot see. So we might think like, our world is color, but actually it's color to us. And similar to that, we assign meaning to things that we see. Like we experience a state or a society or an idea, a concept, and so on. But it does not mean that these things exist as an objective, unchanging thing that also would be there if human beings would not be there. That is already a little bit abstract, but I wanted to throw it in there that really what consciousness is doing is something incredibly special and unique. So where does consciousness come from? And Jung has a very clear answer on that. No one gets conscious if he does not suffer. If you are always in the maternal water of 35 degrees Celsius, you need nothing, but you are not conscious. It seems as though nature tries very hard to bring about consciousness in us. So this is what Jung says. The easiest way to get someone to be conscious, so to pay attention and be aware of something, is to hit them on the head. And he says sometimes it's like necessary when one is gripped by a lot of other things, for example, in the psyche or in the outside world, that they are not aware of their own being in there. There has to be this separation, like consciousness, separation, and the distance. Jung sees their consciousness as a form of adapting. There's a famous book by a Nobel Prize winner. It's Daniel Kahneman, called Thinking Fast and Slow. It's pretty famous, so it's possible that some people have heard of it or maybe also read it. And Kahneman talks there about two systems, system 1 and system 2. One is very fast and one is very slow. That's why thinking fast and slow. And the slow part is a painful part. Like this is where you can do the amazing things where people get immersed and think about stuff and contemplate this and so on. But at the same time, it makes yourself very slow. Like when you're driving a car, you should be in the fast system. But this is like the used behavior, the known territory, reflective part. While the other part is like, I have to learn something. I really have to concentrate here because I have no idea about math or geology. And Jung sees it the same way, or would formulate it the same way. Like what we have in our conscious with our reflexes and our instincts and so on and archetypes, this is a fast system. This is what we have in our toolbox already of human nature when we were born. But the other stuff, the adaptation stuff, this is slow and tedious and really, really not easy, especially when you have new stuff. So consciousness for Jung is there to solve a problem. And one becomes acutely aware of that as soon one hits a roadblock or has a problem. For example, you're driving your car, everything is fine, you're going to work just as you would expect, and suddenly the motor stops. Boom, that's consciousness. Like, oh my God, what is happening? What is going on? And then people start looking around and they're checking and all these, then investigating. They're doing willful action to understand what is happening. They try to bring from the unconscious into consciousness. Okay, what is wrong with my car? What do I need to do now? And suddenly all this entropy erupts like, oh my God, what could this mean? I might be late for work. I might need to buy a new car, but I don't have the money. Like, what car would I buy? Like, did I not take care of my car? So the past comes up and all these different things. So this is suddenly consciousness trying to deal, sort out, to combine and discriminate. Okay, what's the thing to do? Of course, this is incredibly stressful and incredibly taxing. But this is consciousness. The second quote, historically as well as individually, our consciousness has developed out of the darkness and somnolence of primordial unconsciousness. There were psychic processes and functions long before any ego consciousness existed. This means we are not born with consciousness. There's a potential there, like when you have a child, you know, oh, it will become conscious at a certain point, it will say I, it will say no, and it will do its own thing. But when you have a small child, it's only instincts, it's only drives, it's just acting out, and every second it's something else in a different emotion. That's what I mean with this continuity, right? That you can have a certain mood that you can also hold. When you have a small child, there's no control there. It's just acting out. And very likely, this is how human beings been for 99% of the time where human beings existed. So even consciousness existing in human beings is maybe the case for the last 10,000 years when people really started to create complex societies and specialized and all these different things. For that, consciousness is necessary. And what we've done is we created ways to cultivate that. This is why people go to school, they go into training, and we have writing, and like we have tasks, we have assignments, and all these different things. This is to foster consciousness and enable people to encounter the world, to adapt to it, but also specialize into it, but also to express their individuality and become individual, to say like, oh, I really like sports, I want to become an athlete. And for that, a lot of work is necessary. Like, you can't do it without the work. And a lot of that work is consciousness. Having a goal, sticking to the goal, observing oneself, adapting oneself constantly, and changing how one is doing things towards a certain goal. That's all consciousness. This is all willful behavior. So that sounds all very nice. Like, consciousness, great. Everybody should have it. But of course, Jung sees there's certain dilemma of consciousness, certain problems with it, or that are just existing in the way how consciousness is. And I alluded to some during my explanations. The first thing is consciousness is limited. What we know and what we can do is incredibly limited. We are limited beings in an unlimited universe. And this is why we constantly hit our heads against things, because we are constantly encountering things that are new, novel to us, and that are difficult and hard because we don't know about them, we cannot do them. And like, our life's journey and our journey that we take through life is taking things into our consciousness. But when we do something first, we're the fool. We're very awkward. We're doing it wrong, and we have to do it multiple times to get it right. Like, for example, speaking to a girl, like as a guy to a girl for the first time, this is a nerve-wracking, painful experience that you somehow can get better at. But this is what it means. Like, it's limited and it can expand over time. That's a hopeful thing, but it takes a lot of effort. Of course, when we reference to the things that we know and that we can do and that we experience, that's also always directed into the past. So consciousness for Jung means only the things we already have and know. But he says like, oh yeah, there's a lot of stuff in the future, a lot of stuff we will encounter and change into, but that's in the unconscious. This is out of grasp for us. This is not yet available. And this is why he says when you have people in therapy, when they have problems, which are problems now and very often concern their future, people regress into their past and start thinking incredibly hard about their past, because this is the stuff which is immediate available. Because having it in consciousness is always easier than integrating new stuff into the unconscious. So what he would see, for example, that his patients would become very, very interested in their childhood and like their family home and their past and trying to find the answers in the past. And he says there is value in there. Of course, maybe there are unprocessed things there. But at the same time, like, yeah, the future is in front and the fearful place. Like the future is uncertain and novel and potentially pretty painful. But also there's all where the good things are. By consciousness being adaptable and willfully oriented towards the direction, we become what Jung says one-sided, which means we're focusing on very small parts of reality. Jung, for example, sees like 4 functions how information comes into ego and consciousness. So how does new stuff come into ego and consciousness? And he sees there sensation, thinking, feeling, and intuition. This is the basis for his typology model. Sensation saying there is something, thinking labeling it. For example, oh, that's a tree. And feeling is, do I like the tree or don't like the tree? And intuition would be, oh, what can I do out of the tree? I can make some nice furniture, for example. And he says, human beings, as we're born, we're pretty limited. And we have like a favorite function, like we have a favorite hand. And of course, we will always try to do things first with our favorite hand, meaning the other one does not get used. It's not so sophisticated. It's not so elaborate. And Jung says, oh, well, you're a complete human being. You should be able to use all your different functions. So he says, you can get incredibly far by thinking. Incredibly far. You can make a life, a career out of it. But at a certain point, the unconscious, your psyche will come knocking and saying, yeah, but you should also take care of the feeling. And you will hit certain roadblocks because you're only approaching things in a thinking manner. And you have to do a different tool. But this is a tool you are not sophisticated in, feeling, sensation, or intuition. And you need to learn to become the fool again and have to stumble a lot. And it will be awkward and it will be painful. But on the same side, it's like if you do it willfully, you will develop in this direction. You will integrate those things and you will become a more complete human being and you're able to do more things. And most important, like you can become the person you're supposed to be, like you're destined to be. Yeah, this one-sidedness means also incomplete. But this also has to do with like the impressions that we get from the outside or from the inside. We're missing really a lot of things. Like consciousness can hold and we can pay attention to a couple of things at the same time. And we might have the impression that this is then the whole world and this is everything there is. But at the same time, we're missing a tremendous amount of stuff. So, but how does the psyche, according to Jung, deal with the fact that we have a limited, small, unsophisticated consciousness that's struggling all the time, but still can adapt to things and still find a way how to reorientate ourselves? And he says that's the function of the unconscious. So I before mentioned the net, right? The net of consciousness. I want to build on this metaphor. When you want to fish, right? And this is what like fish trawlers do in the open ocean. They have a net and they try to catch the fish. So they're going with the net through the water and they take what they can take. So when you have a net with very big holes and a huge gap between the threads, you can catch big fishes, but like small fishes, they will evade you. And similar is that with consciousness. You can only catch the things that you have the necessary consciousness for to connect it. Like if you have a very simple consciousness, then the holes are very big, where a lot of stuff gets through that you do not know about it because you can only know about the things that are related to your consciousness, to see and experience them. But as you get more and more sophisticated, you notice more smaller and smaller things. For example, when you try to figure out what's wrong with your car, like, you will miss a lot of stuff. But you can go to a car mechanic and they can maybe just even listen to it and say like, oh yeah, there's something wrong in this part, and they can pinpoint it exactly because they have the right net. They can pick up the correct things. Or like when you don't know what to do with your life, you can go to a therapist and they can notice stuff that you don't notice about your life, or about how you talk about things. They say like, yeah, well, you're not talking about that. And there Jung says this is a function of a therapist, or like a friend or a partner in interpersonal relationships, pointing out things that you're missing. Because, as I said, in consciousness, you say like, oh yeah, I can see the whole world. Now I know everything. I can make sense of everything. But the chances are zero that this is true. Like, you can only deal with parts at certain times, but most things are just problems you do not even recognize as problems, as they just wash past you. But it is not only external people that fill this function, but also the unconscious, the psyche. And this is what I mentioned, this old ancient past that has seen everything before. So it will pick up on certain things and then will push things to consciousness to make it aware of that. And Jung says this is what's happening in dreams. So when we dream, it's like you've had your whole day walking around and you did it with someone else, and you saw and experienced everything that you saw and experienced, but you missed a lot of things. And there was this other person that picked up on all these things. And when you go to sleep, the psyche then informs you about all the things that you missed that happened inside, also outside. You know, this experience, like when you go to a new city with someone you even know, they will notice completely different things about the city. And they will point it out like, oh, look here, that's a nice building. Oh, be careful here. And this is what Jung says the psyche does. And this is why he says, oh, you have to kind of build a relationship with that and be aware of that and be open to that, not close down and say like, I know everything. There's no need to change. I don't need to focus. I don't need a goal, whatever. But rather, okay, there's something inside me that could point out things to me that are new to me. And this is the strange premise of psychoanalysis, to say human beings are not the master in their own house, but there are a lot of things happening that we are not aware of. And Jung says this very often, like, for us, the world looks like consciousness. But at the same time, consciousness is way, 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 way smaller than all the unconscious stuff that's happening around us, but also that is happening inside of us. And dreaming and sleeping is already the right cue for the next point, which is when we have consciousness and we have to focus and pay attention, we get tired very easily. Like, if we know something, we can do it automatic. We can drive hours without thinking. But if we do it first, we can do it for 5 minutes without being completely exhausted and sweating and all these different things. So every day for 8 hours and sometimes more, we have to rest just to recharge our consciousness, to be then able again to adjust and adapt to the world and things that are happening there. And you have this, for example, with athletes or like people that work very hard cognitively, that they can do the focus part and the strenuous part for a couple of hours, but then they need to rest. Like, I heard that even for like professional musicians, they would train like crazy for 3 hours and then they would go to sleep and then they would do it again just to recharge again. So yeah, we are easily exhaustible. We're also very easily distractible. And today it's very easy with social media and the internet that something grabs our attention and bam, we're gone. Suddenly we don't have a plan anymore. Suddenly we don't have a focus anymore. And it then weak, small consciousness being overwhelmed with all the things that are happening around it. And yeah, of course, because something is in your consciousness does not mean you're fully comprehended. You can also completely misunderstand the world or situation, and being able to differentiate that and to separate that and reflect on that is a skill that needs to be learned. And especially like in interpersonal communication, this is why we then talk and give feedback to understand like, okay, why is there a problem right now? So this is why we ask questions. And a good example that I heard recently was like, oh, I thought you're angry, but actually you're afraid. So this reflecting, reframing, and so all these functions of consciousness are an important part that we kind of have to do because consciousness is limited, incomplete, very easily exhaustible. So it's like a constant work. We constantly have to work on this ship that keeps on sailing while water is leaking in all the time. And I have some quotes. Man knows no more than his consciousness, and he knows himself only as far as it extends. That's what I mean. This world as we see it, we think it's complete, but actually we're missing a lot. So like humility is a good first step for that. By confining our activity to a single sphere, we have handed ourselves over to a master who is not infrequently to end up by suppressing the rest of our capacities. And this is what I meant with when we focus on one thing, we leave out a lot of other things. So when you have high career people that only work, they have miserable lives. Why? They don't have meaningful relationships because that stuff takes time and they did not take the time. So to be a complete human being, you have to pay attention to a lot of things and handle a lot of places at the same time. So it's a blessing and a curse that we can focus on one thing, but very likely we are missing another thing and we have to then catch up. And consciousness always succumbs to the delusion that it developed out of itself. The consciousness and ego that Jung sees is a phenomena of the psyche. And it emerges, and we do not exactly know why, but it pops up, it develops, it does its thing. And this is how, we start our life and we start our experiences. So this is then our journey through life, starting from a state of complete unconsciousness or as a child, coming up with this like small island of ego and consciousness in this big sea of the unconscious, developing, fortifying, learning, adapting, and experiences all these horrible things, but also to overcome them and grow and collect all the things that is us. And this is what Jung calls individuation. And individuation, you have, and basically all concept that Jung talks about. And this is this becoming an individual, so becoming unique, but also to become separated of other things, of external influences, internal influences, which does not mean to suppress them or ignore them, but rather learning how to integrate them, learning how to handle them. And this is a very nice notion that Jung has about one's life and how one should live one's life. He says, you're starting out and like all the future things about you are in the unconscious. And your life and your individual journey is about collecting those things and bringing them home, like returning back and combining the things, gathering the things that should be combined and gathered. And this is then the life one ideally lives and brings together. And that makes one what one is. And this would conclude my presentation for Jung's idea of consciousness and all the different aspects he saw there and the different interactions he saw, especially with the unconscious. And I want to thank you for your attention, and I hope you had fun, and I hope you learned something. And I'm now really curious about the discussion part. Thank you. This was this event's topic. Thanks for tuning in. If you're interested in learning more about Jung, please check out the description.